I'm very grateful to City University for inviting me to come here for 2 years. I was invited to come here for 1 year in 2011, and after a few months, the then Dean, Professor Kingsley Bolton, an old friend from Stockholm, suggested that I should extend my contract for another year. And I was very easy to persuade to do so, because I've really been very happy in Hong Kong. I would very much like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to my colleagues in the Department of Chinese Translation and Linguistics, as well as in the Chinese Civilization Center. And not least, perhaps above all, to all the students that I have met here. It's been a truly exhilarating experience for me to get close to a number of students from China, from mainland China, and from Hong Kong. This has been so important for me that this experience has indeed influenced, I think, my view of China and China's future. Again, thank you so much for having me here for a couple of years. These years are the final years of my professorial career, perhaps. I'll soon be 67 and I'll retire in the summer. And looking back on more than 40 years in academia, I must say that these 2 years are among the very best that I have ever had. Being invited to give this lecture this afternoon, I think of as a kind of farewell present. I'll return to Stockholm next Saturday, and to have this opportunity to give this talk is really, for me, a very precious farewell present gift. I would also like, in all modesty, to think of this lecture as an attempt on my part to give City University a small present. An insignificant present, but nevertheless a present, a gift. And I think it's very nice, actually, to be able to think of one and the same event as a gift in both directions. Maybe this is what exchange and academic exchange is also about. And speaking about exchange, I very much look forward to much more exchange than we have had between Hong Kong and Sweden in general, and between City University and Stockholm University in particular. Only last week, the president of Stockholm University visited City University with a delegation, and they were extremely impressed by what they saw here. And I know that Stockholm University, the leaders of Stockholm University, are now much looking forward to concrete collaboration in various fields between our two universities. And when I go back to Stockholm, I will also do my very best to promote this. It's also my impression that President Goway and other representatives of City University are very keen to promote exchange between our universities. I have quite a lot on my mind this afternoon, so I shall not say much more. Well, 2 more things. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to Lawrence and Xiaolin Xulam in the Chinese Civilization Center for helping me design this PowerPoint presentation, which without their help would not have looked the way it does this afternoon. I'm very grateful for that. And then finally, and perhaps above all, I would also like to officially here express my deep gratitude to my close friend and somewhat elder brother, being 1 day older than I, Professor Zhang Longxi, who brought me here. Longxi and I are friends since more than 15 years now, and by every year we get closer and closer to each other. It's been extremely stimulating, of course, for me to be so close to you for such a long time, and I hope to see you next time, before long, in Stockholm. In the 1970s, a few young philosophers in France who had been Marxists suddenly turned their backs on Marxism. In best-selling books, the 2 leading representatives of these nouveaux philosophes, as they were called, André Glucksmann and Bernard-Henri Lévy, argued that Nazism and communism were closely akin and had similar intellectual roots going back to Fichte, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. Specifically, they argued that the Soviet Gulag, as described by Solzhenitsyn and others, showed that Marx had been wrong, and they traced the roots of the Soviet tyranny back to the basic ideas of Karl Marx. In best-selling books, one of them was La cuisinière et le mangeur d'hommes, Réflexions sur l'état, le marxisme et les camps de concentration. Strangely enough, this very important work does not seem to have ever been translated into English. It means that most of you will discover The Cook and the Cannibal, Reflections on the State, Marxism, and the concentration camps. And the other book was the La barbarie à visage humain, Barbarism with a Human Face, of which there is an English translation. These new philosophers were becoming popular in 1976, when I returned to Sweden from China after spending 3 years in Beijing as a cultural attaché. During those 3 years, I had become more critical of the communist rule in China than I had been when I first arrived there. I also asked myself to what extent the political oppression in China was rooted in Marxist theory. Yet, to me, there seemed to be such a long distance between the dry theorizing of Karl Marx in his main work Das Kapital and the Soviet Gulag that I remained unconvinced by the arguments of André Glucksmann and Bernard-Henri Lévy. But the question intrigued me, and I spent quite a lot of time reading and thinking about it and discussing it with friends. Of course, the issue that the new philosophers addressed was a special case of the general question about the relationship between ideas and practice, which has been discussed in many different contexts. In my teens, I had become convinced that religion was a conservative force serving the prevailing order by directing people's attention away from the world here and now. I believed wholeheartedly in that early 20th century atheist Swedish radicalism, which dressed up in the philosophical ideas of positivism and value nihilism, rejected anything that had the smell of metaphysics, that ugly word, metaphysics. I saw this Swedish radicalism as a sophisticated version of the monistic materialism of the French Enlightenment, which had left little or no room for a transcendent, divine dimension of reality. Then I began to read Max Weber. As you know, Weber was not satisfied with the explanation for the rise of capitalism that Karl Marx had offered, and he argued that Protestant Christian thought, especially in the form that the French theologian John Calvin had given it, had played a decisive role for this process. Weber pointed out that Calvin had emphasized the tension between ethical demand and human shortcoming, the ethical demand anchored in a transcendent divine ethic, which dictated that humans were duty-bound to exert themselves to overcome this tension, although forever doomed to remain imperfect. And Weber found this emphasis had contributed decisively to the rise of industrialism and capitalism. Weber's views seemed diametrically opposed to the early 20th century Swedish radicalism that I believed in, and especially to the materialism of the French Enlightenment. Then in my reading, I found that the Marxist philosopher Herbert Marcuse, one of the famous representatives of the Frankfurt School, while not exactly sharing Weber's evaluation of Calvinism, still tended to express a rather dualistic tendency in giving prominence to what he described as system-transcendent thought as a prerequisite for revolutionary change. Thus, I became aware that people held very different views of the social dynamics of basic philosophical orientations, as defined in European tradition in terms of such dichotomies as monism, dualism, and materialism, idealism. When in the early 1980s I began to study Confucian thought, and especially the ideas of Daijun, these questions concerning the social dynamics of basic philosophical ideas were at the back of my mind. My decision to study Chinese philosophy had nothing directly to do with them, but my studies of Daedron soon led me back to them. It seemed that Daedron's critique of Neo-Confucianism offered an interesting angle on them. And this is what I wish to speak about here this afternoon. What can Daedron's critique of Neo-Confucianism, and for that matter also his critique of Buddhism and Taoism, tell us about the social dynamics of basic philosophical orientations? So who was Daedron? Let me recapitulate some basic facts about his life.